So, the first topic that we're going to speak about is reacting to a diagnosis. So, receiving a diagnosis of dementia can stir up a number of emotions. So, some of those emotions that are commonly experienced can be shock and numbness, as well as denial. So, in the beginning, denial can be a positive and protective force for us. So, we use denial to kind of shield ourselves from painful news while we adjust inwardly to a new reality. People may also experience anger and frustration. So many people feel angry and frustrated about the diagnosis. They may be angry at the disease, themselves, their doctor, or at other people in their life. And often people experience some form of grief as well. So people may go through periods of feeling helpless or powerless in the face of this diagnosis. They may feel sad when considering the losses that this disease may bring, or they may feel worried or fearful about what will happen next. And then there's acceptance. So, acceptance does not mean necessarily that you're happy about the situation. With acceptance, you're accepting the problem rather than avoiding it and realizing that the situation must be adjusted to rather than actively changed. Because as we know, often we can't change the fact that we're living with this diagnosis, but how we adapt to it is often within our control. And so, even when we feel that we've reached a level of acceptance, it doesn't mean that we won't feel anger, grief, or even denial again. And so, unfortunately, it's not always a straight path forward, but can be a winding road. And so, I'm going to direct the first question today to you, Arabella. So, Arabella, how did you react to hearing your diagnosis? And what did you think and feel in the first few weeks or months that followed?
Soon after being diagnosed with MCIs 7 or 8 years ago, I reacted with overwhelm, staggering fear. I doubted the value of living. I was worried that be like my father in his early onset dementia, no longer the brilliant, dynamic dad that I know, but a stranger who could not do things for himself, had temper outbursts, and constantly got lost. I was frustrated with the loss of my functions. Spent much of my life looking for lost things, paying for medical appointments I missed, having avocados and produce rot in my car because after buying them, I forget to bring them up to my fridge. And my biggest embarrassment, my smoke alarm blasting the fire sounds beep, 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 and shouting, fire, fire. Oh my God, I turn off the stove. I take the burning pot into the sink, open the window, and fan the smoke alarm to take out the smoke. And oh, I hope it'll stop beating and shouting fire. Oh my God. Next time I buy alarms, I'll choose the soft beeping ones without a voice that shouts fire. No more. My biggest loss. It appeared I could not write speeches anymore like I did in my professional speaking and training career that I loved. Unable to write, looking at the blank screen for 3 whole days, I often gave up in frustration. And I thought the one intellectual activity I so enjoyed seems lost to me now. And it caused the greatest grief to acknowledge I had to give that up for the rest of my life. Most of my life, I lived by my wits. Without my memory, is life worth living? My friend told me, Arabella, you might as well have Alzheimer's. You're so obsessed with it. And my siblings told me, big sister, don't tell anybody. Just
Yeah,
don't think about it. All of us
yeah,
go through aging anyway. I told my friend and my siblings, I believe there's a small window of opportunity, especially at the start of dementia spectrum, where I can still seize that window to lessen the risk of going into full on dementia. I need to seize that opportunity while the window is still open because I believe it won't be possible when I'm already in full on Alzheimer's. And that was how I started with my journey.
Thank you so much, Arabella. It's so many emotions to work through shortly after a diagnosis. And we're so grateful that you are here today sharing your story with us. We've had so many people living with dementia share their stories as well, and it's incredibly powerful. So, Fred, I'd like to ask you a similar question around how your journey started and how you reacted to receiving a diagnosis.
Well, the diagnosis has been a couple of years ago now, and Rosie was the person who reached out to the organization after the diagnosis and said, "My husband's got this. What do we do now?" And your organization pointed us towards these group sessions of recently diagnosed folks. And I thought I had accepted it fairly well. I don't know. But I do remember that when the lady leading the session uh, listed some of the aspects of uh, acceptance, like denial, anger, curiosity, whatever. I do remember saying to her, "There's one more word or emotion that you should have up on that board, and that is guilt." Because the more painful aspect of my acceptance of the diagnosis had to do with recognizing uh, the
Impact.
recognizing that I wasn't the guy I used to be, that I didn't have the capacity I used to be. And I used to pride myself on being somebody that my partner, Rosie, and my adult son and daughter could rely on and had done since they were born or since I met her. And so I felt the most difficult thing I felt was guilt, that I could not service them or be the guy that I had been for them for 55 years, 50 years, something like that.
48.
Thank you.
Not 55.
Between the two of us,
We get
we get there
50
eventually.
straight,
Yeah. Anyway, that was the more difficult thing for me was guilt. I felt guilty about the diminishing capacity mentally. I've tried to compensate for that by upping my physical activity, but it was for me. It was even though I don't blame myself for getting it, that's what I was wrestling with: the loss of capacity or amount of support I could give the family, who've really stepped up marvelously. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Thank you, Fred. And you're right. I think guilt is an emotion that so many of us on this journey experience. And it's often something we hear care partners talk about. And you're right, people living with dementia can experience those emotions too. So thank you for sharing that. Rosie, as Fred's partner, what was that experience like for you, and how did you react to his initial diagnosis?
Well, as Fred said, really, to begin with, we had gone through a similar experience with Fred's mom who had dementia. So I started quite a few years prior to the diagnosis seeing some of those same kind of warnings, that maybe something wasn't quite right. And so the journey for me was trying to get help and to go to the family physician who again would say, oh, it's aging, or it could be this, we'll give it, more time. And as time went on, I realized, no, in terms of my background in education, early intervention was something that was really important for the kids I was dealing with. And for me, it was, we need to know what we're dealing with so we can do as much as we can, when we can. So it was going to an initial workshop with Alzheimer's Society that gave me the language to use when I went back to the doctor to say, you know, it's time for this kind of an assessment. We need to know what we're dealing with. So, you know, I felt a lot of power because I was able to move through these things really before Fred came into the picture to start to deal with that. So I felt empowered because I was doing something, and that helped. You know, when we got the diagnosis, that I was able to relax a little bit and to think, well, at least I'd done as much as I could to ensure that we were going to get the help and the support that we needed. And so once we got the mild cognitive impairment diagnosis and Fred was struggling with that, again, I took my time to kind of introduce him to the Alzheimer's Society. And it was on one of the lived experience Zooms that, you know, some of your speakers were just so positive in terms of it wasn't a life sentence, that, you know, we were able to embrace it a little bit more and be more positive, learn about it. And so, you know, that was my journey, just making sure that we got the diagnosis and we could start to put some strategies in place. So
I agree. I came away from that webinar with, I think, Jim Mann and
Yeah.
another gentleman, as well as a lady who had been diagnosed
it for many
for
years.
20 years. And
Yeah.
she was sort
Yeah.
of 90 at the time.
Still, you know, able to travel and talk. So that, I think, gave us both a lift.
Yes, it changed a lot of, I guess, prejudices I didn't even know I had when I saw these guys interacting with each other and joking. And if there was a little word retrieval issue or something like that, one of the other guys would say, "Spit it out," you know.
Yeah.
And it was the humor and the camaraderie. I came away from that particular webinar quite changed in my thinking.
Thank you both for that. I'm so glad that the society was able to be a positive part of your early
Yeah.
days, and
Very much.
you speak so beautifully to the power of sharing firsthand experiences and stories in platforms like the webinars. And now here you are today sharing your story and
Yeah.
hopefully instilling hope in others that are listening, and because it doesn't mean the end of a meaningful life. And so thank you for telling us a little bit about what the start of your journey looked like. Heather, I'd like to hear a little bit about how your caregiving journey began and how you reacted initially to your mom's diagnosis.
Well, the first hint I got of suspicion was when my dad died in 1993, I started phoning my mom every night and continued with that. And we were night owls, so I always phoned her at around 11 o'clock at night. And one day I said, "But Mom, we talked about this last night." And she said, "Oh, I take my Ativan. Don't count on me to remember anything after I take my Ativan." And I thought, well, okay, I accepted that. And then we went on a cruise together and spent 15 days in a cabin. And I noticed all kinds of little hints, but the thing that made me want to take her to the doctor was she said, "I don't want to go to formal night. I'm just going to stay in the room." And I said, "Okay, that's fair." So I went into the cabin 5 minutes before dinner to put on my dress, and my mother was fully dressed for formal night. And I was surprised. And I said, "I thought you weren't going to do it." And she looked at me like I was crazy. And I just let it go. But that's when I thought, okay, there is something going on. Let's go to the doctor. So we had the same family doctor, and so I talked to the doctor ahead of time and went in with Mom, and we got diagnosed very quickly, and we got to see a gerontologist in New Westminster very quickly. So that was good. Mom was kind of surprised that I was pushing her to go to the doctor to deal with memory issues, because she, of course, hadn't seen what the issues were. And that continued on throughout the journey, that she was living in a little bit of an alternate universe. And so I said, let's sit with this for a month, because it's a lot. And so, and I wasn't living in Burnaby at the time anymore. So I came back to Burnaby and we talked about it. And I said, Mom, you're fine here. You can continue doing all of your stuff. I mean, just, yes, you have a diagnosis, but you can still do everything that you're doing. And if it comes a time that you can't, then we'll talk again. And so continued on with the nightly phone calls. My mother won Citizen of the Year in the city of Burnaby in 2008. She was very engaged in the community. She volunteered 6 days a week with different organizations. Her biggest shock and stigma was that, but I got straight A's in school, and I was smart, but you're still smart, Mom. You can still do all of the things that you could do. Even before she started to decline, she was exactly who she always was. For me as a caregiver, I was also at the time dealing with my husband, who was in end-stage liver failure. And so I was trying to figure out how I was going to manage supporting him and supporting Mom at the same time. And it was a challenge. In hindsight, I am so glad that I was able to support my mom through her journey. We had a lot of fun. I got to spend so much more time with my mom than I otherwise would have been able to. And at the end of the day, she said to me, she had this moment of clarity 2 days before she passed, and said, "Thank you for showing me how much I'm loved." She just came back to tell me that. And that just made all the hard stuff melt away. And so I think as caregivers, there is so much joy and love in the journey, even though it can be difficult to, to lose the person you love slowly, but they're still there, just different.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for sharing that beautiful last moment with your mom. It's incredibly touching. And you're right, if there's a silver lining sometimes is the relationship, it doesn't disappear throughout this disease progression. It changes and we adapt, but the person remains and the love remains. And so thank you for sharing that. We're going to talk a little bit more about loss, because that is an aspect of this journey. So receiving a diagnosis of dementia or mild cognitive impairment is often accompanied by a series of losses. So it can be helpful to both identify and acknowledge the secondary losses that follow as a result of a life-changing diagnosis. So grieving secondary losses is a normal and healthy part of learning to adjust to our new normal. So an example of a secondary loss may be the loss of the identity, the way that we saw ourselves and knew ourselves, or the loss of the future that you had planned. Retirement may not look the way you thought it was going to look. And when we identify these losses, we're better equipped to understand our own grieving process and give ourselves grace, as each loss is important, and it's important that we grieve each loss, and it's real and very valid. And so I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to talk a little bit about a loss that you've experienced. So can you share a secondary loss that has impacted you? And Heather, is it okay if I start with you?
Sure. Um, it's my world. I was very fortunate that I was able to retire quite young, and so I didn't have to deal with juggling work and caregiving. But retirement became caregiving became my retirement, and so as things progressed, I lost my own engagement in the community. I had to give up my volunteering. I had started a small business with a friend, and I had to step away from that. My world as my mother's world shrank, my world also shrank because she needed more support from me. And so um, it took quite a bit for me to gracefully let go of those things and accept what life was becoming. But again, it was fulfilling. It wasn't burdensome. It was um, I'm more of a positive silver lining type of person, and I think that helped me a lot because I knew at the end of the day that everything that I was losing, I would get back, and I just needed to focus on relationships and um, recognizing the value that caregiving provided. Yeah. So it was, yeah. And then and then rebuilding afterwards, which is where I'm at now. Because at the end of the day, it was literally, okay, I don't do anything anymore. What is it that I do? And I was forever changed by the experience.